If they fail to meet any of these requirements, we are going to know through, again, our access and transparency, and that will immediately lead not only to us, but the international community, the P5+1, taking the appropriate actions.
And we welcome you back to America's Forum. I'm John Bachman. Miranda Kahn will be alongside in just a moment here. That was Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz, present during the latest Iran negotiations and also has become like the face of these negotiations, telling CBS that the current framework allows unprecedented access to ensure that Iran does comply with that deal, whatever it may be.
That access in the current agreement is what experts say, though, isn't enough, John. Many say the transparency measures have blind spots and could allow Iran to build weapons in covert locations like underground North Korean sites.
And that's why I want to go a little bit more in depth on this subject. And for that, we'll bring in Eric Javits, former ambassador to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. Now, we see Ernest Moniz out there, Ambassador. He is the Secretary of Energy. We don't see the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of State making these comments. But of course, nuclear energy is a big deal here, but we're not worried about nuclear energy. We're worried about nuclear weapons.
Correct. And we have only a framework. The framework itself seems to be incomplete. The details are still unknown. There's an awful lot of work to make a framework agreement a real agreement. And I'm afraid that the things that we really need are not even in the framework agreement.
Like what?
Well, SNAP. Getting decisions anytime, any place to do a SNAP inspection. You have the IAEA, which is essentially a UN bureaucracy. Right now, if they want to do an inspection, they have to do it to a declared facility. They can't go anywhere, anytime on very short notice. So how are they going to discover anything? And if they happen to have to rely upon environmental testing, like air samples and so forth, that may take weeks. If it looks suspicious, another test round, another couple of weeks. Then they have to present that to the UN IAEA and to the UN Security Council. That's maybe a month or two of screening further. I mean, it's a bureaucracy.
So it's not like they're going to be able to show up, walk in these facilities and say, we're here, we want to see them.
Right.
The other point you were bringing up too, Ambassador, is the Iranian population. So much attention has been paid to President Rouhani, President Obama, but the real swing vote in all this is the Iranian people themselves.
Well, there are 80 million Iranians. There's a big middle class and quite well off, even in spite of these economic restraints we've put on them. However, can they overcome, is it possible for them to overcome the oppression that they're getting from the mullahs? Well, there's a council of experts that basically put the head of the decision-making process into question in I think a couple of years from now, whether he's going to remain there and whether or not he does, whether or not the people can express their desire, is a bet. It's a risky bet because there's about a 10-year period where we hope the Iranian people can have another opportunity like they had in 2009.
You're talking about the Green Revolution there, and President Obama decided not to get involved. Do you think he was looking for this type of deal down the road, and that's why he didn't get involved when so many said he should?
No, I don't think he even had this in mind. I think he was just backing off a great opportunity, which he's done in lots of places, waiting, delaying, refusing to make a decision until it's too little too late.
Why do you think he's pushing so hard for this deal to happen?
Basically for his legacy. He wants to have something before he leaves office. Well, Kerry is part of his administration. Kerry is the point man on the negotiation. I'm sure Kerry is doing the best he can, but if you don't have the real threat of walking away from the table, you can't negotiate successfully. And because he's serving Obama, who wants this, he hasn't been able to walk away from the table.
And he serves at the pleasure of the president.
And only the Russian walked away from the table briefly.
No walking away, and we wound up with this quote-unquote deal, and still a lot to talk about between now and June. The White House press secretary yesterday couldn't even say if these guaranteed inspections, what the timeline would be to roll back the sanctions. We still don't know so much. And Ambassador, we got to take a short commercial break. We'll be right back. We'll continue the conversation here in a few moments. Ambassador Eric Javits here with us on America's Forum. John Bachman in for J.D. Hayward today. Miranda Kahn and I will be right back after this short commercial break.
Our hope is to be in a position where we can open an embassy there, that we can start having more regular contacts and consultations around a whole host of issues, some of which we have interests in common. I don't expect an immediate transformation in the Cuban-American relationship overnight, but I do see the possibility, a great hunger within Cuba to begin a change, a process that ultimately I think can lead to more freedom and more opportunity.
There you have President Obama speaking with NPR's Steve Inskeep on plans for the Cuba and the potential of having normalized relations with Cuba down in Havana. The president making a round of interviews now as he tries to sell the Cuba plan and the Iranian deal.
Yeah, the President Obama is set to come face-to-face with Raul Castro during the Summit of the Americas. This will be the first time Cuba's actually been invited to attend the summit, marking new steps towards a new relationship.
But a couple issues have come up. Cuba wants to be taken off this state sponsor of terrorism list, and also the United States, we want to have their diplomats be able to walk around freely, talk to Cuban people. We're going to bring in a former ambassador, Eric Javits, to talk more about this. And we were talking about something, Ambassador, in the course of the break there. You mentioned Iran, an outlaw nation. Cuba the same way. The president seems to be kind of glossing over this fact.
Well, it's a fact which stares us in the face. And if we're going to try to get them back into the international community as a legitimate member, we need to play our cards carefully, because we've sort of crashed in there, giving them what seems to be a complete license. And now we have very few cards to play. One of the cards I think we should be careful about is opening an embassy. That is a card that we ought to ask some concessions in exchange for that.
And it's interesting you bring that up, because they were actually supposed to open an embassy prior to the summit. That didn't happen. Do you think that was intentional?
Well, there may be, the administration may actually be demanding certain things in human rights. They may be demanding certain things about terrorism, not taking them off the list immediately. I think making them behave in a proper fashion for some test period, or putting them on probation, so to speak. I mean, there are things we still can do without alienating the Cuban people. And you don't need American diplomats running around Havana, because they're all going to be considered CIA anyway. What you need is, I think, to send in some business people. They'll be very cautious based upon the administration's despotic methods, and maybe the fact they're dangling the bait of economic help in exchange for some reforms economically and some openness in their accounting systems and so forth. That might help. I agree that we have a period of time, it could be 10 years, 20 years, to try to defrost that relationship completely and make it a healthy one. But while the Castros are there, we're not going to succeed.
And we know there's also a lot of European commerce in Cuba as well, and that money goes straight to the Cuban government. But with the United States now getting more involved in Cuba, is there going to be some pressure applied to our European allies to say you should demand these same civil rights and freedoms that we do if we're going to do business on that island nation?
Well, we might try to enlist them. I don't think we can push our European allies around. I think we ought to ask their help, their support, and or their understanding for what we're trying to do, at least.
We do need them, though. You can't push them around, but they're a vital part of this process in Cuba, but also the one in Iran.
Well, they've been very free in sending their tourists to Cuba. They're not quite as active in terms of investing in Cuba.
What about, there's talk that Ecuador's leader isn't actually going to be present, kind of in protest to the U.S. And let's not forget, Cuba, one of its closest allies, is Venezuela.
Well, inviting Cuba to the OAS and to sit down and so forth, again, that's another card that we played, I think, prematurely.
Yeah, you hear the president saying he wants to take Cuba off the state sponsor of terrorism list, but you don't hear specific demands made in public to get that in return, which raises a lot of questions and also goes back to what you were saying, too, about the negotiations going on with Iran. There was not an explicit push to get involved in these negotiations that Kerry kind of backed into them without demanding more from the Iranians before we got started. But we'll have to leave it there. And of course, Ambassador, we'll always have you back, because we always learn something when you have you here.
Nice to be with you.
Always a pleasure to see you, sir. More to come here on America's Forum. We're about ready to wrap it up and hand it off to Midpoint. We want to quickly talk about the Comedy Corner before we go away. We'll be back with more in that right after this.